So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get us started and ask for Mr. Petrilli to come on up.
Great, thanks. All right, good afternoon. That was pretty good. That wasn't bad. All right, excellent. That was a pretty nice lunch there, huh? This was not school cafeteria food by any means. I'm Mike Petrilli. I am the president of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C., a city that is about to get crazier than ever, it appears, if you were looking at your newsreel during lunch. That means I'm a policy guy. Fordham is a think tank. We also do on-the-ground work in the great state of Ohio, but it is really an honor to be back here in North Carolina. Become something of a second home for me. I've been here quite a bit over the years, and it's always just such a pleasure to be in a place where you've got so many people working across education and business and policy and government to try to make things better for kids in North Carolina. You've got such an amazing history of that. So I get to kick us off, and then you're going to get to hear from the real experts, which are the educators, and then we're going to have a discussion with everybody. And what I'm here to talk about today is a study that you heard referenced earlier and some of the takeaways about that, and that was a study that we did on grade inflation. Now, before I get into some of the details on that, I have to make an admission, which is that as a policy wonk, a policy person, and not somebody who's in the classroom all the time, we policy people, you'd be shocked to know, sometimes we make some mistakes, right? And we sometimes assume that the world works in a certain way that turns out is not the way the world works at all. So we policy people, we think that, if we get a policy passed and we pull this policy lever or that lever, that is going to lead to certain change in the real world. And here's another example of where that doesn't always play out. The change I'm talking about is what many of us have been working on over the past decade, which was to dramatically raise academic standards. And we did that. We did that nationally, and you did that here in North Carolina back in 2010, adopting much higher standards than you had before. And then several years later came along the much more challenging assessments. And so that was good too. And then more recently, under the Every Student Succeeds Act, new accountability systems that are more transparent and also in many ways fairer, looking at how students progress over time. Now, the hope with all of this was that by changing these policies, we were going to be able to shift expectations, the teacher expectations and parent expectations, and even student expectations to much higher levels. That's because the old standards really were designed to be standards for getting kids to basic literacy and numeracy. And the good news is we made a lot of progress. You look from the 90s into the 2000s, we made something like 2 to 3 grade levels worth of progress for our lowest achieving kids and for kids of color in this country and here in North Carolina. That was dramatic progress, but it was progress getting kids to a fairly low bar. And so the conversation 10 years ago was saying, okay, that progress is good, but it's not enough, because if we actually want students to not just get to basic literacy and numeracy, we actually want them to get on track for college and career and citizenship. We actually want them to be able to graduate high school, yes, but keep going in their education so they can get a middle-class job. We've got to raise the bar. And so that's what we've been doing. And it's taken us almost 10 years to get all those pieces in place. And just now, we've got this new system around these new higher standards. So that's the good news. The bad news is, we haven't always seen the real world respond in the way that we would like. We're going to talk a lot today about how educators think about higher expectations. But what we were worried about was around parents. We thought that once we had tests that were telling parents once a year that actually, I'm sorry, but your son or daughter is not on track, right? We've set the bar much higher. And now in North Carolina, what is it? Probably about 40% or 50% of kids are hitting those proficiency marks every year. Okay, so half the parents are being told once a year, your child is not proficient, they are not on track. Okay, and that's happening around the country. But when a group like Learning Heroes, this national group in DC, has gone out and surveyed parents every year and asked them, do you think your own child is on track? Do you think they're at grade level? You want to guess how many parents say yes? 90%. 90%. And that has not changed one bit in the last few years, even though we went from these low-level tests that used to say that everybody's doing great, right, to these much higher tests saying that actually half the kids are not where they need to be. But that message has not gotten through to the parents. And so, a lot of us have been wondering, like, what was it? Why is this message not getting through? And of course, educators and those of us that have gone through as parents are going to say, well, duh. Of course, it's because you've got this one test once a year versus all year long, the grades that your kids are getting on their assignments, the grades that they're seeing 4 times a year on their report cards. That's what parents are paying attention to. And that is, in fact, what the research is showing, is that parents rely, not surprisingly, understandably, and for good reasons, they say, I trust what my kids' teachers tell me. If they say my kid's doing fine, I believe my kids' teachers. If the report card says they're getting A's and B's, then I say, great, my kid's doing great. The problem is, we worried about, what if there's a discrepancy? What if we know on the tests, which aren't perfect, don't measure everything, right, aren't always right, but if on the tests, year after year, that student is not performing at a level that puts them on this trajectory for success, but they're getting A's and B's, how big a problem is that? So we wanted to find out. So we did this study, the guy named Seth Gershenson at American University, using North Carolina data. And because North Carolina has great data, that's why all the national studies are based here. And we looked at these questions. And we wanted to understand how big were those discrepancies and have they changed over time. The first bit of news that came out of it is good news, which is that there's not a crazy pattern. There's actually a pattern that makes sense in that students who get good grades tend to be the same students who tend to do well on the tests. And the kids who are getting lower grades tend to do worse on the tests, okay? That's good. That means that at least grading is not completely disconnected from these other measures of achievement, all right? The bad news is that there's still a big disconnect for some kids. And we focus especially on this question about students who receive Bs. Now, this is using data from North Carolina looking at math classes versus the math end-of-course exam. And what you see is over a third of kids are not hitting the proficient score on the math test, which is not the highest score, okay, which is a fairly modest score, but they're still getting Bs in their math class. All right, now again, it doesn't mean that the test is right and the grades are wrong. It just means that there is some discrepant information. And the worry would be, if we're talking about high expectations, and where it really becomes real to kids and to parents is not the test, but the grade they're getting in their class, then maybe we haven't quite gotten there in terms of those expectations. That's an issue that we have to think about in terms of teachers, but it also explains why most parents out there still, are fairly complacent. They think their own kids are doing fine, okay? In terms of progress over time, what we see from this chart is that there has been some grade inflation. Basically, GPAs have gone up over time, both for the top, that's the more affluent schools, and the less affluent schools at the bottom. You will notice that, as said before, there are the kids in the poor schools tend to do worse on the test. They tend to get lower grades. There's that relationship. But we do know from this study and from lots of other studies, and a new study out from TNTP called Opportunity Myth, that you still see that it is much easier in general to get an A or a B in a poor school than in a more affluent school. Okay, so that does indicate that there is this soft bigotry of low expectations or something going on. For some reason, the teachers in these high poverty schools, what they consider to be A-level work might only be considered B or C-level work in the richer school across town. And one thing that we need to talk about is, why is that happening and what can we do about it? Is it simply that a teacher who's taught in a high poverty school with a lot of kids coming from poverty who maybe come in relatively low achieving, when they see, the top 2 or 3 kids in their class, do work that's better than everybody else, they say, well, that's A-level work. They may not know themselves that across town, that would actually not be considered A-level work. It would be considered C-level work. But when their kids leave, right, we hear these stories about kids who are valedictorians and have the 4.0s, and they get to college, and then they say, what happened? Why are all my peers who grew up in the affluent suburbs, who went to these affluent schools, why are they all way ahead of me? I was a valedictorian. I was told I was doing great. And the concern is because we haven't made high standards real and consistent across the state when it really matters, which is around grading. Now, one last thing that we did find, which was a bit of a surprise, is when you look at grade inflation as measured over time, we see for poor kids, or for poor schools, you see the trends are moving in the same direction. They've actually done better on the tests over time, and their GPAs have come up over time. For the affluent schools, the test performance has been pretty flat, but the GPAs have gone up. And so that means right now in North Carolina, the place where you've at least see the standards seem to be getting lower over time, or there's more inflation, is actually your more affluent schools. And whether that's because of parents putting pressure on the schools and teachers to make sure that all of their special snowflakes get A's and B's as they get ready to apply to college, or what's going on there. But I think it indicates that this is an issue, not just in high poverty schools, but everywhere. And so back to my policymaker hat, again, it's obvious, maybe should have been a duh, we should have thought of this all along. But if we're going to make this whole movement towards high expectations real, by all means, we've got to pay attention to the standards and the tests and the accountability system and those levers, but where it's really meaningful in the real world of teachers and parents and kids is when it comes to the assignments kids are given and the grades, and that's where this conversation needs to go next. How do we make sure that we have consistently high expectations within schools, across schools, so that nobody gets to college as a valedictorian and finds themselves behind because their own school had lower expectations for them than across town. All right, so I don't exactly know how to do all of that, but the good news is I don't have to, because the experts are coming up next. We're going to hear from some educators about putting these high expectations into action. So thank you. I'll see you again